Well, 62 days ago, a new phrase hit the world headlines: heart transplant. At Grootshaw Hospital in Cape Town, the world's first surgical operation to transplant a human heart was performed by a surgeon virtually unknown except to a handful of other surgeons. After the praise came the criticism. At first, it was no more than a murmur. Today, it can be heard round the world. A question the world is asking: should the heart doctors? Heart swapping is direct killing, Vatican. As well as secular and religious protests, there were those which came from medicine itself. Soon it became clear that the medical world was divided. In spite of further heart transplant operations in other parts of the world, that gulf grows wider each day. The split is widest of all in Britain, typified by this attack. It appeared in the BMJ on the 19th of January. It was signed by 3 well-known doctors from Hammersmith Hospital in London. Tonight in London, before a gathering of doctors, lawyers, churchmen and journalists, Professor Barnard meets some of his critics.
Professor Barnard, what is your reaction to the type of adverse comment on your work which we've just been listening to?
Well, the way I feel about it is that everybody is entitled to his own opinion. I think if people would like to criticize our work, they are welcome to do this. As long as they have the facts and they know what they're talking about, then we don't mind it very much. We, in ourselves, feel that we have nothing to hide. We've done what we thought is correct, and therefore, if the people would like to criticize us, then we are willing to answer them on their criticism.
And this is precisely what you are here to do tonight.
Yes.
Dr. Martinus Botha is the assistant member of the Cape Town team who is responsible for matching and cross-matching, tissue typing between donor and recipient. What is your reaction, Dr. Botha, because you are equally involved?
Yes, I feel that perhaps the link in the chain which I represent in transplantation is the weakest link of all. That is the link of the serologist, the immunologist. I am therefore perhaps more amenable to listening carefully to criticism, trying to learn as much as I can from the criticism, trying to get a perspective on what I am asked to do. Criticism is always welcome as long as it's constructive, and I appreciate it.
Well, there then we have a complete statement of their attitude to this type of comment from both our guests tonight.
I'm very, very interested in this, the definition of success. I have here the issue of the South African Medical Journal of December the 30th, which is entirely devoted to your first operation. There's a paper here by yourself. It's entitled A Human Cardiac Transplant, an interim report of a successful operation performed at Grootshaw Hospital, Cape Town. In the front of the editorial, ringed in black, are these words: "We regret to record the death of the patient, Mr. Louis Wyszynski, on the 21st of December 1967. In the editorial, it is written, the claim successful can be used even at this early stage, because to date it is a feat which makes medical history, no matter how short the further survival of the patient might be." Do you agree with that?
Well, you notice we didn't say a completely successful heart transplant.
You didn't say completely successful. You
just said a successful heart transplantation. Well, as you say, it depends on your definition of success. I think it was successful in that we were able to show that the doctor can take a desperately ill patient and they can remove his heart and then take the heart from somebody who's dead and transplant this heart into this ill patient, get this heart to restart again and to function very adequately in the post-operative period, and revert all the ill effects of heart failure to more or less normality again. I think that my medical colleagues here will agree with me that this is some success.
But isn't it true that successful heart transplants have been done in dogs for years? What's the difference?
The difference is that in a dog you use a normal dog and you take out his normal heart, where in human beings you take a very sick man and you take out a sick heart. That is a big difference. This heart transplantation has revealed some very, very interesting, not complications, but aspects that we never considered in our experimental work. To give you some example, how does a small heart function in a big pericardial sac? We've never had this before. Secondly, how does a normal heart function in an abnormal vascular bed? We've never had this before. Then, of course, our main studies are on how to diagnose rejection in the heart. This has been difficult in the animals. You know, an animal can't tell you, look, I've got a headache, I don't feel well, I don't like eating. One's got to go to the human being at some stage to help you to make the finer diagnosis of your problem. For example, we've shown without a doubt that the electrocardiographic changes that Shamway and his group has described is not reliable in transplantation in the human being because of the fact that the heart is in a big pericardial sac, can be covered with fluid, and therefore you can get changes in the voltage of the electrocardiogram. I think our main project in the future will be firstly how to select a better donor so that we get a closer match. Secondly, how to diagnose rejection of the heart, and thirdly, how to combat rejection of the heart.
So far, I believe the questioning has been somewhat technical. We have not only a medical audience here, perhaps we could broaden the scope in due course. But you, Professor.
It's self-evident to the profession in most cases when death has occurred, and in those few cases where it's not clear that death has occurred, these are cases which should not be considered for transplantation. And a very good safeguard for this is to have another team of doctors looking after the person who might become a donor compared with the team who's doing the transplant operation. Now, what I would like to bring up is a point that is a little broader than the previous ones, and it really is the basis, I think, of all the criticism that has descended on your head. This is the way in which the publicity has been handled. Now, in early transplantation surgery of the kidney and in early open heart surgery, there were a very large number of failures. The failures were much greater than the failures in the early stages of heart transplantation to date. And yet it was never front-page news. The nauseating publicity that some parts of the press and television and radio adopted for this transplant in Cape Town, I think has done harm to the profession. It's done harm to yourself, because why was it necessary to have pictures of the donor and his relatives? Why was it necessary, as Lord Brock said in his article in the Times today, to have the personal details of the donor known to the recipient? Now, I know what newspaper men and television people are like. They're terrible once they get in. But it's quite possible for a doctor to say, I refuse to have anything to do with details of my patients. My patients give me they give me their trust privately as a doctor, and I'm not going to divulge their names or any details about them. And I really feel that if you'd adopted this, you wouldn't be sitting here now answering just criticism, but it would be purely adulation, certainly as far as I'm concerned.
So I'll tell you, if you could do that, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din, because it was just impossible. We tried to stop all publicity to start with. You will remember, if you heard the first reports of this, no names were mentioned. But afterwards, it was completely impossible. It just snowballed. We had no control over the matter. It's just something that you can't control. I mean, it's
sorry to get back to this South African medical journal, but this is a remarkable feat of medical publishing. It's certainly nothing like it has ever happened before. Within 27 days of the operation, you've got a whole issue of a scientific journal dedicated to this one thing, and all the articles are lined up. You've got a lot of advertisements, too, from drug houses and from firms who make instruments related to cardiac surgery, and these carry congratulatory messages. I can't feel that this has been done without the pretty wholehearted support of everybody concerned.
So that journal is meant for our medical colleagues, not for the public to read. If you've read, are you a doctor?
Yes, sir.
You are.
He said he was.
Oh, I see. But these are meant for our medical colleagues. I don't think they would think that this is premature. This didn't claim anything. That just told them what we did and how we did it. I don't think this was really publicity. Look, let me ask you one thing. Let me just go on to this publicity. If you feel that we were out for publicity, then you must credit us with very little knowledge. Because firstly, we never went on the air or on television beforehand and say we're ready to do a transplant. Look at us, we are going to do a transplant within the next 3 months. Secondly is, we didn't take a single picture during any of these operations. Do you think if we want to publicize this operation, we wouldn't do those things?
I really must come in on your side, Professor Barnard. I do believe the publicity was utterly beyond your control. You were dealing with the heart, which, unlike the kidney, occupies a very ancient place in the archaepsychology of mankind. That was a very potent factor, I think, in focusing attention in an uncontrolled way that would not be applied to transplantation of the kidney or the bladder or the stomach.
And there, as you know, Professor Barnard, is the comment of a very distinguished colleague.
I'll tell you, the first surgeon who transplanted the heart in this country, let him stop the publicity. I would take my hat off to him.
Dr. Bater.
I thought this should be a matter for the record to just tell you very briefly exactly what happened after the completion of the first heart transplantation. We went into the doctor's tea room, we sat down, had a cup of tea, lit a cigarette, and Professor Barnard said, well, what should we do now? There was a little silence, and the suggestion was made, perhaps we should inform the medical superintendent of the hospital that we had, in fact, undertaken the operation and it was successful. There was one simple, single telephone call. Sir, we have just transplanted the heart and the patient is well. After that, the question was raised as to the identity of the donor. Now, Dr. Bosman, who had had the unenviable task of obtaining consent, then volunteered to us that the father of the donor had asked for anonymity. And I pointed out at that stage that we have a law in South Africa that the identity of a blood donor may not be disclosed to anybody, and that we should observe the same principle as far as organ donation is concerned. I may just add, I have since written to our Minister of Health. I happen to sit on an advisory committee to the Minister of Health on blood transfusion regulations. I've written to the Minister insisting that it should be made illegal in South Africa for the name of a donor or a recipient of an organ transplant to be made public in any way at all.
Could I say something?
Yes, by all means, Dr.
Speaking as a physician who's never done a heart transplant, one thing is about this South African Medical Journal. South Africa is a pretty small place, population-wise, and I'll bet they were pretty proud that they were the first country in which this had been done, and I think a certain amount of excuse is due to the journal for that. But I would like to point out, quite apart from that, that publicity has a good side as well. I'm not saying that there aren't undesirable things about this publicity, as there have been, the donor's name and all this sort of thing. But it has its good side. In the first place, I suppose most of us believe that cardiac transplantation will go on, unless we find that we really haven't overcome the rejection phenomenon at all. But probably it will go on, and we want to influence public opinion gradually, don't we? So that people will let it be known that their organs could be used if they were involved in some road accident and that sort of thing. And lastly, on the publicity side, you know, in the old days, and I'm not going to call them the good old days, but of the charity hospitals and so on, you could do almost what you liked to the sick poor, you know, and nobody would question your results. And there is something to be said for having done a transplantation of the heart and to have let the world know about it so that you do get the criticism, if criticism is going to be.
Thank you very much. And may I follow on from what you say? would your attitude towards publicity when you perform your next operation be entirely different as a result of the experience which you've recently encountered?
Well, sir, the way I feel about it is I don't want publicity. I wouldn't like to encourage it. But as I've told you before, I'm quite sure that we will not have control over it again. You know that our second patient that we selected was a complete secret. Yet somehow ever they phoned him in the middle of the night and said to him that they want him at the hospital and that he must take an ambulance to the hospital and rush to the hospital. This was done by journalists. Now, where they find these things out, why they do this, I'm not quite sure. But I'll tell you, it's just too difficult. We just couldn't manage it.
Actually, I can explain what happened in this particular instance. There was one slip of the tongue. It was said that, yes, there was a second patient who would be suitable for heart transplantation. He is a dentist, so ill that he cannot practice. It's the only statement that was made. The journalists went through the directory, phoned every dentist in Cape Town until they pinned him down. Now that we cannot control.
As a journalist, to the defense of my own colleagues in the whole of this situation, and I think perhaps we have a vital and helpful part to play in presenting your work, not only your work, but of your fellow surgeons, to the public. Now, in the case of that self-same dentist, I believe, according to your early prognosis, Dr. Blayberg should, in the terminal stages of his heart disease, have died perhaps mid-January. He is today now still living, and he has outlived, perhaps, or has been given a new lease of life 2-3 weeks longer than he would have had. Now, this, to my mind, is the essence of the work you have done. You have given this man more time to live. Now, can you tell us, perhaps, the physiological changes that Dr. Blayberg went through after the operation?
I think this is this sort of change that you get after correcting a hemodynamic fault in the heart is well known to surgeons. When you have a failure of the pump, you get congestion of various organs. The common ones that we see very often is congestion in the lungs, congestion in the liver, congestion in the kidneys. And as a result of the damming back of blood in these organs, they fail and their function deteriorate. Now, we know that in a patient where this failure of the pump is due to a defect in the valve, when you correct that valvular lesion, you often get a very rapid change to normality or a change towards normality. Often this is not complete in the case where you do just a valve function, where you just do a valve correction, because the myocardium is affected and therefore you don't get complete return to normality. However, in the patients in which we've done heart transplantation, this has been very, very obvious how quickly functions, deterioration in the function of the kidney, the liver and the lungs return to more or less normal range. We know that in both these cases they had, I think the first patient had a blood urea of 179 when we operated on him. His blood urea was back to more or less normal within 4 or 5 days. He was jaundiced. This returned to normality early on. He had congested lungs. He was able to sleep flat immediately after surgery. He didn't have to sit up for breath. So these are very obvious and very rapid and very remarkable changes you find when you correct the pump in a heart transplantation.
In other words, your patient findings, you can hardly claim that your first patient had a lot of good done to him. What are your expectations for the second patient?
I'll tell you, this is not possible for me to answer that question. I mean, this is a new field. We have to feel our way. I can't tell you how long he will live, how well he will live. It's not possible for me to tell you
well,
that.
I think this leads straight to, I think, a major question, which I don't think has been asked yet. What is it that decided that you were in a position to undertake this experiment?
I think
when others around the world, who technically were in a position to do exactly the same thing, have held back.
I think I've gone into that in great detail already.
And Dr. Bader jumped at the word experiment.
Yes, sir, please. This was not an experiment.
But your colleague just now said that we don't know what happens to a small heart and a large pericardium, etc., etc., etc. We've got to do the human experiment. These were the words used.
If I may interject, I didn't get a reflection of your reaction, sir, from the distinguished surgeons along the front row. They don't seem to be as concerned on this specific point as you yourself.
I think it might be if we go to a private audience.
Yes.
I'm sorry, this is not a very good question or an answer that you've just given. Please, I'm sorry.
Sir Thomas.
May I come in speaking as a surgeon? I was a little disturbed by the title of this particular subject, Facing His Critics. They're not all critics. This is a subject at which a very large number of surgeons have been working over the years. 50 years ago, no one touched the heart. They were told we mustn't. Sir George Pickering will remember some of the early attempts he and I had with heart surgery only 20 years ago. We didn't see then that open heart surgery would be a routine procedure performed every day. We've seen grafting develop slowly. We've seen blood, the best tissue graft of the lot, bone, blood vessels, cornea, kidneys, and the logical sequel. And all experimental work has been tended to draw towards heart and lung over the last few years. The Professor Barnard and his team have been the first, and there always must be a first, that has been able to prove a success of some time is, of course, the great triumph and the reason he is here. And it is a first, and it is the one thing that will encourage other people to go on with their research work and go into all the complex ethical and matters of philosophy that are bound up with this. Because, as Professor said over there, it is a very emotional organ with a lot of mystique around it. But remember, it is only an efficient pump.
Thank you, sir. May I just a moment, Mr. Wagner. May I ask that gentleman there who was unhappy about the previous answer if that has helped?
I would like to ask a question.
Well, by all means.
A surgeon who is not involved in transplant surgery. What did the heart show histologically of your last patient?
I think perhaps Dr. Buerta, who is more of a pathologist than I am, would be able to tell you better.
And please, would you explain histologically for the benefit of the lot of us?
We have some slides. If you can we project them somewhere?
Yes, we can indeed.
I'll tell you, if we could have... would you like just the heart?
Well, there's a letter from... This is gamesmanship, nothing more. There is a letter from your professor of pathology from Cape Town, which arrived to one of my colleagues today. He is not quite as happy as you are. I quote...
wait a minute. I didn't say I was happy about the findings. Did I say that?
No, this is quite true. But let me tell you, I would like to know what you found on point of your rejection.
We know what we found in the...
Could you tell me?
Yes, Dr. Buerta will tell you. What's more is Dr. Porter has the slides, have all the slides today, and I give him my full permission to publish his findings as well.
It's not Dr. Porter, it's Professor Thompson.
No, but Professor Porter has the slides too. We brought it with us to him.
Were there no signs of rejection in their
No, we
heart?
didn't say that. Dr. Buerta will explain to you.
Please do.
Dr. Buerta.
Because this is the heart of the matter, isn't it? Forgive me for the pun.
As an immunologist, I would expect some evidence of an immunological attack on a transplanted organ in every instance where the transplant is not from one identical twin to another. Mm-hmm. And the present basis of our knowledge of tissue matching, methods of controlling the rejection phenomenon, I expect to find microscopic evidence of rejection in every organ that is transplanted. May I ask Dr. James Mowbray whether he would agree with me?
Well, as one of Professor Porter's team, we've looked at the heart of Wojtkański, and there is not any evidence which is indisputable of rejection at all. There is some histological damage, some cellular damage, which is possibly attributable to the cobalt radiation, but no evidence of rejection.
Now, may I answer the question further? In Cape Town, when I saw the sections the first time, I said, as far as I'm concerned personally, here there is evidence of rejection. Better histologists disagreed with me on this point. I stuck to my guns and I said there are certain lesions which to me indicate rejection. To my pleasure, I learned today somebody much better versed in these things than I am, that these changes may in fact be due to the irradiation which the heart receives. But the sections are available for anybody who wishes to see them. I only want to make one thing clear. The press have played up to a certain extent to the fact that these sections were not sent from Cape Town to London immediately. Now don't forget, the donor, the first heart transplant, was killed in a road accident. There is a charge of homicide pending. The whole question is sub judice. I think it would be reasonable for any histologist who looks at the histology of the heart removed at post-mortem. This is the heart originally belonging to the donor, subsequently belonging to the recipient. It's quite important that the other tissues of the body should also be studied. I cannot enlarge now on the post-mortem findings in case of homicide, but there's good reason today to believe that the donor in that instance was suffering from some form of autoimmune disease already before the heart was removed and transplanted. Certain lesions in the aorta was not transplanted, certain lesions in the aorta, and only for those reasons did we hold back the sections, did not send them out of the country, out of the jurisdiction of Cape Town.
You feel that you know enough to be able to perform this type of surgery again and again and again?
No, sir. But I'll tell you, if I'm faced with the same patient, same set of circumstances, I would certainly encourage my colleagues to go ahead with the operation.
Might I just come to the aid of the Cape Town group here? I think it is a monstrous criticism of a surgeon not to perform an operation because he doesn't know what the result is going to be. If he thinks in good faith, on the basis of his research work and other people's research work, that this is the best that he could do for his patient, then it's a monstrous thing to criticize him if he does it well.
I'm sorry, misconception. It's absolutely wrong.
It's absolutely
You can
incorrect.
cut a man in half
not
to
true.
cure a cancer. What have you left? What sort of life have you left? It isn't true that any form of treatment is better than none. There is a stage when it's better not to treat.
Well, now, this seems to represent a distinct cleavage of opinion between your point of view, sir, and the point of view of the surgeons here who say, on the contrary, it is better, because if the man is going to die and you can contribute something...
I'm sorry, I must interrupt. I disagree with my very learned colleague. You have to do a certain amount of work on animals. And this work must be sufficiently important, sufficiently definite, before you can actually work on men.
There are dogs living 2 years with transplanted hearts. One dog has had a litter of puppies. If that's not good enough...
No, how many of those have lived 2 years? And how many dogs have been done around the world? And why? No.
Would the pathologist's point of view be relevant?
Can I just ask,
yes,
you're a general surgeon?
Yes.
You do esophagectomies for cancer?
Yes, I do.
How many esophagectomies for cancer have you done in dogs?
That's not the same That's the same question at all. This is gamesmanship. That's not the same question. We don't have tissue rejection. I'm sorry.
I sense that whether or not it's gamesmanship,
but it's not
the
a
audience
tissue rejection
thinks
question
that
at all.
satisfactory answers. Can we have can we move on to the religious point of view, perhaps?
Well, it's very obvious what profession is mine, Mr. Baxter. I've been disturbed by a certain tone of the critics, and I've been rather heartened to find that the applause has set that right, because I wouldn't like it to be thought that all of us sitting here were critical of someone who has accepted this massive responsibility, and accepted it, I take it, with a very real sense that this was the right thing to do for his patient. After all, at many points, it would seem to a medically lay person, a doctor must have to make a decision in the case of a very sick person whether there is a chance. Now, by definition, I would have thought that Dr. Barnard had had to choose people who were very severely sick, so that in a sense he has made his experiment, if you could use that word, harder, but ethically more justifiable. This, I must say, appeals to me as a Christian on the grounds that what he is trying to give is a genuine life. A certain ethical problems seem to me to be arising in the mere prolongation of existence by medicine or surgery that don't seem to me to arise anything like as sharply when what is being given is a much fuller and richer and truly human life. Now, I have taken it that Dr. Barnard has intended this for the people on whom he's operated. The fact that this mystique gathers round the heart, and that mystique has gathered all of us tonight, is confusing, and I wouldn't like it to be thought that because that mystique has played a part in religion, that necessarily the Christian person is frightened of heart transplant when he isn't, say, of giving his blood or donating his cornea or whatever. To me, the attempt may, if it has been, as I believe it has been, and everything that Dr. Barnard said throughout this program has convinced me, made with very real responsibility, this is a worthwhile thing because it is an attempt to give a really richer and fuller life to somebody.
May I,
Mr. Mugridge, sir.
May I attempt to put a question, an aspect of this matter which is admittedly irrational, but which certainly represents something that I feel very strongly, and I think also is felt very strongly among a certain number of my fellow citizens. My feeling derives from the Christian concept, which might seem rather derisory in this company, that man is made in the image of God. This is a basic Christian notion. And from it seems to me to follow that man's body, like all creation, deserves our deep respect. Now, the view of science, from which I admit the majority of people today get their moral concepts, such as they are, suggests that, in fact, man's physical necessities must take precedence over all others. And it is in following this notion that, as I see it, our human society is being transformed into a sort of vast broiler house or factory farm, such as satirists like Orwell and Aldous Huxley have envisaged. And it is because I see these heart transfer operations as part of this process that I instinctively find them deeply repugnant.
Professor Barnard, are you turning us into a lot of broiler house fun?
No, don't let that deflect you, Professor Barnard, from seeing, it's quite a sort of good idea, but from seeing that there is in what I'm saying something that is deeply felt, not as a joke. You know, the poet Blake said, "A robin redbreast in a cave puts high heaven in a rage." Now I wonder what the fury of heaven would be at the notion that our bodies are collections of spare parts which can be... all their hands are going up, you see. All their hands are going... And I'm quite aware that all of them regard this as a completely absurd thing. But it's not, you know. The funny thing is it's not.
Let's have Professor Barnard.
Yes, I want one more question to put to him.
I think Professor Khan would like to talk to my
I have a picture that I would rather like to show. It's older even than Mr. Mugridge.
Gentlemen, I congratulate you.
It's a painting of Fra Angelica of the legends of Saints Cosmos and Damian doing a cadaveric transplant of a leg to a man who had a cancer of the leg and was dying of this, and the leg was removed from somebody who'd recently died. And according to the legend, this was a complete success. Now, this, I think, is an extremely important concept. It's a concept that goes back to the earliest of Christian thought, and it's not a new idea, and I doubt if there is any serious religious objection to this type of principle of a dead person helping to save the life of somebody who's afflicted with a mortal disease, particularly if that person is relatively young and can be restored to a reasonable existence. It's no different. The concept of treating such a person is no different from the concept of treating somebody with severe appendicitis or with perforated ulcer.
And what a happy coincidence that you should have happened to have the picture with you.
I may just say that I'm sorry I can't give you the exact text and verse, but the heart transplantation has been predicted in the Bible. It says that I will remove your heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh.
The devil said it.
I don't think it's wise.
No, but you know, in point of fact, this is tremendously evading something that I assure you is very genuinely felt. You're simply evading it by producing this picture by various devices.
But this question of evasion, Mr. Baxter, I don't think, with all the deference to Professor Barnard's scriptural memory, that quoting a text helps a great deal at this point. I would like to know who said it. My memory isn't good enough. But I do think that when Mr. Muggeridge says he has this feeling, and many citizens have it, he is absolutely right.
Thank you.
I am sure he is utterly wrong when he fathers it onto the Christian faith.
The fallacy...
That may well be.
The fallacy in Mr.
Can I
Muggeridge...
ask if Mr. Muggeridge would refuse or accept a corneal transplant if he were blind and it was going to restore his sight? Because this surely is exactly the same.
No, it's not exactly the same, sir, with all respect.
Well, would you answer the question?
Certainly. The point is this, that
would you accept a corneal graft?
I would, under certain circumstances, accept an eye because I would know that it was removed from a body that was indubitably dead. You see? Indubitably dead.
May I hear this point? Yes.
The point where people start to say, you shouldn't transplant this patient, it's not in their best interests. There is at least one transplant patient in this audience. Shouldn't they have a right to say what they think about it, instead of us deciding whether they should be transplanted or not?
Would the transplant patient make himself known? Is it you, sir?
Yes, sir.
Are you the transplant patient? Well, is it you, madam? What is your reaction to Mr. Muggeridge's attitude?
All I can say is I'm very grateful for my spare part.
And are you well?
Yes, perfectly well indeed.
Can we know what the transplant is in the lady's case?
It's a kidney transplant.
From South Africa?
No, I'm from Australia. Yes.
In fact, Mr. Muggeridge has changed his ground.
How have I changed my
Mr. Muggeridge, when he moved on to, he knew that a corneal graft had been taken from a definitely dead person. Then he's changed his issue to the first point raised by my neighbour at the very beginning of the programme.
Yeah.
But that is a different ground from regarding us as the image of God and a mere collection of spare parts. This is a quite different ground ethically.
Yeah, the fallacy in Mr. Muggeridge's point of view is that if man is made in the image of God, then God must have a great many malformations.
Yes, sir.
As a medical student...
As a medical student...
I should like to ask Mr. Muggeridge if he would accept a blood transfusion from a patient who is indubitably alive.
Not only would I accept it, I've given my blood and given it with the utmost satisfaction, given it with a sense of delight in being able to help someone.
Was equally
A sense of absolute delight. Almost everything I say makes these distinguished doctors laugh. It's very gratifying. Very gratifying indeed. I wanted to ask Professor Barnard one question, may I?
Yes.
The question is this, Professor Barnard, that's been puzzling me all the time. It's a slightly different tack. Why was it that this operation was first performed in the Union of South Africa? Was it because in the Union of South Africa there were more brilliant, more audacious surgeons? Was it because in the Union of South Africa there was better equipment, finer facilities? Or was it, as I suspect, that because of the vile doctrine of apartheid, in South Africa life is held cheaper? Life is held cheaper. I want to answer why was it in South Africa?
I've asked your question, Mr. Muggeridge. Would you care to reply?
Yes, I think I'd reply. I think we have fairly good surgeons in South Africa. I think that my colleagues will agree with me that they have here in this country some very good surgeons who are South Africans, heart surgeons and other surgeons. So I feel that we have good surgeons. Secondly, I think in South Africa we have excellent facilities to do this type of surgery. Thirdly, I think that you should think that we hold a very high opinion of death and human suffering, because we did this operation with the purpose of treating a sick man and relieving human suffrage.
You haven't really answered my question, have you, as to why it should be South Africa?
That I can't answer, sir. That's impossible.
Because, presumably, because Professor Christian Barnard and Dr. Berta and their team were working in Cape Town.
Yes, and therefore you would say that it was because they were better prepared, more skilled, better facilities than they did it.
You can't say
May
that.
I say, sir, that I and most of my colleagues disassociate ourselves from the question placed to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. The medical opinion disassociates itself. May I move on to this question?
I'm one of those miserable communicators and not a man of science.
A
I
journalist.
find it very painful to hear the peerless protest of Mr. Muggeridge generally addressed to pills and pot and politicians, to heart transplants. I suggest it was done in South Africa because there was a happy marriage of circumstance. The right recipient, the right donor, doctors of knowledge, research, and guts. They were ready, and the congruence of circumstances were very fortuitous. It seems to me that Mr. Muggeridge beggars the question. Actually, he would accept a corneal transplant if he were quite sure the patient from whom he received it was dead. Certainly, you only make heart transplants from patients that you are quite certain are dead. It seems to me that this is a lineal descendant as an operation from the kidney transplant and the liver transplant, and maybe all the way back to the bone graft. It seems to me, too, that Mr. Muggeridge would be torn asunder if he were present in the 18th century at the passage of the Anatomy Act, allowing doctors to dissect cadavers. He would find us interfering with God's image there. Why do we address ourselves to the really important issue, which haven't been touched on here? Well, immunosuppressive drug research. Has it kept sufficient pace with cardiovascular surgery so that if you perform a brilliant and successful piece of surgery, that patient can live because you've got drugs sufficient to repress the normal instinct of the body to reject the thing? Secondly, how are we going to deal with the inevitable fact that this operation is here, and thank God for it, and that it will be performed in great numbers? Where will the staff, which was voluminous in your case, where will we create such staffs? Who will pay for it? How can understaffed hospitals and ill-equipped hospitals deal with that? And then what new compromises have to be made in terms of another definition of death? Perhaps a bit more lenient one, where the brain encephalograph records nothing, but the heart may still be beating. That's a vegetable, and perhaps that person should die and his heart be transplanted. Perhaps the legal, the medical, and the religious authorities need to coalesce in new interpretations and new rules.
I think perhaps the immunologist is not kept up with the skill of the surgeon, but then we must remember that he's got a much more difficult problem than we have. To us, it's just a technical operation, which really is not difficult. To him, it's exploring the secrets of life and the ability of the body to react to something that's foreign, a very basic response of the body. That is why we're alive, because we respond to something that's foreign. And I would say that it's not kept pace with the skill of the surgeon, but this is not the fault of the immunologist. And I don't think that this should stop us from continuing as a surgeon, because this type of work stimulates more research. And therefore, I'm quite sure now the immunologists will work much harder. The people who's working on immunosuppressive drugs will work much harder. But I must say that they have developed to the stage that we have some hope of success with any type of organ transplant. I've quoted some figures to you. I mean, how can you have more brilliant results than 75% of kidneys transplanted from cadavers functioning a year later? I mean, that's terrific advancement already.
Right. I would like to ask a question that an immunologist would ask, and that is probably best directed to Dr. Berta. And it is this, that in kidney transplantation, we do know that if you get a good match, the chances of a clinical success are extremely high in skilled hands. On the other hand, if you don't get a particularly good match, some of these patients do, I think, to an immunologist surprisingly well. And this is a very important thing. Now, I would be very interested to know exactly what part your matching tests played in these two operations that you have done. Did you in fact get time to do the tests before the patients were transplanted? What sort of match did you manage to obtain in these two cases?
Well, the position was somewhat different in the two operations. In the case of the first patient, we knew that we would only transfer, at worst, an organ which carried one histocompatibility factor, which is lacking in the recipient. He carried nearly all the antigens which we know are important and which we can define. So that, in fact, the operation commenced before I had finished my tissue typing. But this decision had been taken some days before. There was no question here of the surgeon waiting for me to say go ahead, in spite of the rather dramatic announcements that had been made by the lay magazines and journals in the lay press. In the case of the second patient, the situation was somewhat more difficult. The second patient lacked at least 3 antigens, which I consider to be important, basing my opinion on retrospective and 1 or 2 prospective analyses of renal transplants. And I think we were lucky, mathematically, we were lucky to find a donor which gave us exactly the same degree of mismatch. In other words, there was an incompatibility for 1 tissue antigen.
I think this underlines a very important point, because people were criticizing earlier on the fact that one was venturing into the unknown here, and you couldn't, in effect, guarantee a result. That was virtually the grounds of one of the criticisms.
Because of the tissue typing problem?
Well, no, that amongst other things. Now, here we have an unexpected finding, which turns out to be the benefit of the patient. And now, if Professor Barnard had not gone ahead, then no progress would have been made, and one might have assumed a principle existed where, in fact, it doesn't exist necessarily.
Could I say, as one of the surgeons in this country who's been doing experimental work on heart transplants for years, that our criticism, if it was criticism, was based on a fear that everyone would rush into transplantation before everyone was ready for it. Indeed, we saw in America that this did happen. And while congratulating Professor Barnard on this remarkable feat, I think he would agree that this is not yet a clinical reality in the sense that any hospital who has a cardiac team can undertake this operation. I think that if this happens, we're going to get so many failures that the public reaction against it will effectively postpone the day when we can all say that this can be safely done.
Can we all do it? Sir?
I've been terribly worried listening to this discussion this evening on several aspects. And there's one small thing I'd like to say before getting to the main meat of my reason for talking, and that is that I'm a little worried about the criticism about publicity. I think we must tear down this barrier of mystique, mystery, and ignorance which surrounds the medical profession. We must come into the open and tell people what we've got to offer.
You speak as a surgeon, yes?
Yes, indeed. Now, there's one patient here, one person here this evening, just out in the wings there, who has been waiting since 1962 for what Chris Barnard has made possible. And he's coming in the side there. And this man, in 1962, said to me, "What is my future? I need a new set, I need new heart, and new lungs." And he's been following the research which has gone on in this country and the rest of the world with great interest. And I'm sure he's not the least impressed with the phony ethical arguments and with the invalid, I think, criticisms of the tremendous thing that Chris Barnard has done. And this man has been tissue typed by Van Root and has been waiting for his heart transplant for a long time. And I think we must bear in mind people like this. He is not the only man who desperately needs a heart, not only in this country, but all over the world. And I just hope that all of us here bear in mind the plight of these people when we're having these academic discussions. To us, this is an interesting academic discussion. To him, it's the future.
Thank you, sir. May I
of course
speak to your patient? Of course, we will respect your identity, sir. But may I ask what your reaction has been to what you have heard Professor Barnard say tonight and what has been said?
I've followed Professor Barnard through the whole business, and I've been thrilled because I have been waiting since 1962 to live a life which I hope a new heart is going to give me.
Yes. And you are obviously entirely happy about taking the major step of accepting this particular surgery.
I will take it tomorrow.
Given the opportunity.
Given the opportunity, of course.
Is there any particular question which you yourself would like to ask Professor Barnard, with your permission, sir?
I don't think so, because I have listened to Professor Barnard each time he has spoken, and I'm perfectly satisfied that what he has done can be done for me. What he has done for the chap in South Africa, this latest one, can be done for me. I can become a new man, I can live a life, instead of this.
May I ask how long you have been confined to a wheelchair?
I'm not exactly confined to a wheelchair, but I can't walk about to any great extent. And I've been like this since 1961.
And again, may I ask what hope has been given to you by your surgeon? I mean, to what extent what promises has he made?
He's made no promise except that he will do his best to fit me with a new heart when the time arrives. And I've been looking forward to that time for a long, long time.
I think we are moving you just a little bit because of the camera and the microphone rather than anything else. But thank you very much indeed.
Can we ask why the patient has had to wait until since 1962 to have this operation?
Yes, why did the patient... Thank you very much indeed, sir, and good luck. Why did the patient have to wait until since 1962 for this operation?
I don't want to talk too much about this patient because I don't want him identified and harried by the press. This man had a myocardial infarct and heart block. And to cut a long story short, he had one of Adrian Kantrowitz's first pacemakers. He's had 25 operations for heart block pacemaker.
25?
25 operations. Most of them emergency procedures over the years. And he, some years ago, in the middle of this saga of surgery, said, well, is it worth going on? And I explained to him that in the future, the research, the progress which is being made, might indeed enable him to have a new heart and lungs. And this has given him hope and drive to carry on.
You would say it has kept him alive just the prompt?
I hope so.